Good evening, good morning. My name is Andy Cutchins, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C. And we are having a podcast discussion on the topic of Afghanistan's relations with Central Asian states, Afghan Central Asian relations. And we have a terrific panel to take the lead in our discussion today. Now, I have to say that when I planned for this, I did not anticipate the ISIS-K attack on the Crocus City Hall in Moscow, and I kind of leave it as an open question to our panelists: to what extent does that tragic terrorist attack taking place 6 days ago change our discussion today? I mean, if we'd held this on last Thursday, March 21st, before the attack. So with no further ado, let me just read briefly the brief biographies of our three discussants, beginning with Jen Mertashvili, who is founding director at the Center for Governance and Markets and professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. She has more than 25 years of experience conducting research and living across Central Asia. She's the author of 2 books on Afghanistan and has advised the World Bank, USAID, and countless other organizations. She's a contributing editor to the National Interest, our website here, and was named by Prospect magazine as one of the world's top thinkers. Following Jen will be an old friend and colleague, Tom Sanderson, who is the principal at Tom Sanderson Consulting, where he leads a team serving clients on geopolitics, terrorism, and frontier markets. He's the former director of the Transnational Threat Program at CSIS, where we worked together for about a decade, including working together on a couple of projects that looked at the development of the Northern Distribution Network in this region 15 years ago, and followed up with a study of thinking about a modern Silk Road strategy for Afghanistan. So, Tom, it's great to have you back together on the program today. Tom's produced dozens of CSIS reports, in particular reports on Russian-speaking terrorists in this region. And then we will have Zakria Barazkai. Zakria is a former top diplomat in Afghanistan with more than 30 years experience working across the private sector, international organizations, NGOs, and the Afghan government. He also received his MA in International Relations from the Moscow State Institute for International Relations, MGIMO, a very prestigious institution. So he knows Russia and Moscow very, very well. And he's currently a PhD researcher in international affairs at Altinbas University in Istanbul, Turkey. And he is focusing his work now on Afghanistan's transboundary water issues and water diplomacy. So, Jen, why don't you take the floor and lead us off?
Sure. Thank you very much. And it's really wonderful to be here with all of you and seeing many familiar faces here, but also in the audience as well. So, and a really esteemed group of experts in terms of the attendees here. So please look forward to comments. Just want to begin with some brief comments on the ISIS attack in Moscow and how that affects the relationship between Central Asia and Afghanistan. That attack will be extremely beneficial to the Taliban in Afghanistan. All of the countries in the neighboring, Afghanistan's neighboring countries, all of them, have one interest in Afghanistan right now. It's not natural resources, it's not mines, it's not investments, it's security. And the attack in Moscow underscores the importance of establishing security inside of Afghanistan. So the ability of militants to use, ISIS-K or ISK, their ability to use Afghanistan as a launching ground for these kinds of attacks, or at least a place where they can organize, reminds us of what happened, 20 years ago with Al-Qaeda. And we know what the lessons are when there's a security vacuum inside of the country. So the Central Asian states and Russia who have long had a strategy with the Taliban to promote security first, will continue to do so, and even more so. The relationship with China, for example, really stresses security. Now, it's wonderful to have, for example, for the Uzbek government, who's very interested in trade routes and so forth with Afghanistan. It's impossible to have those kinds of connections unless there's security inside of the country. And I remember when Afghanistan was collapsing, the republic was collapsing in 2021, we'd hear comments from the Russian media from some commentators about the need to Kadyrov Afghanistan. And so the idea was that how do you promote stability in Afghanistan in the long run? It's through authoritarianism. And the idea would be that the Taliban could promote this kind of thing. Now, I'm not saying everybody in the government in Moscow endorsed that perspective, but it's certainly one that you heard quite a lot. So it's no secret that we are seeing, Chinese really up its investments in surveillance technologies and those kinds of things, because the idea is the Taliban will be able to provide that kind of security. The Central Asian states are very concerned about the increasing the potential for insecurity and I think the devolving security situation that we're seeing inside of Afghanistan, because it presents a direct threat to them. It's really important to note that the only time Central Asian states have been attacked there have been attacks launched from Afghanistan have been since the collapse of the republic in 2021. There have been rockets that have hit Termez, the Uzbek border, and have crossed into Tajikistan as well. So this is not a mythical threat. I know in the past, Central Asian states have certainly used the excuse of Islamic extremism to crack down on their own citizens. I wouldn't be surprised to see that kind of thing happen again. And we're beginning to see, sort of reversals of openness towards Islam, for example, in Uzbekistan. Really seems to be reversing course on some of the openness towards religious practice that was introduced in the post-Mirziyoyev era. So the bottom line is that this attack in Moscow will really strengthen the position of the Taliban, may encourage governments to recognize the Taliban faster than that they had anticipated. And one final thing, Russia, I read it was almost a year ago that Russia produced a declaration. It was actually from the SCO, I believe it was, and Lavrov penned this declaration himself. And it was about the future of the government in Afghanistan and demands on the Taliban. And when I read this declaration, it was almost as if it was something that would have been written by the Obama administration during the surge. It called for an inclusive government. It called for the return of girls to school, the need to be, inclusive in all types of government. This pressure on the Taliban will not go away because Russia and the neighboring countries recognize that when the Taliban are not inclusive, it really undermines stability in the long term. So now we're seeing, for example, increased reports of attacks by the National Resistance Front. We're seeing, these increased attacks by ISIS-K. So the Taliban domestically seem increasingly vulnerable, and this really strikes at odds with their need to encourage more domestic investment. They need to be able to show neighboring countries that they are stable, that they are healthy, that they can steward this kind of investment. And the Taliban need this investment to feed their people. So I think that's a very long response to your very short question. So I'll look forward to hearing comments. Yeah.
Let me just ask you a follow-up question on that. There is somewhat of an element of deja vu all over again with this, and that you have a global or at least regional jihadist group that has some basis in the territory of Afghanistan, that is conducting terrorist attacks in neighboring states, as well as in Kabul a couple of times, including on us back in August of 2021. How would you characterize the relationship between the Taliban and ISIS-K itself, and kind of maybe compare that with the Taliban's relationship with Al-Qaeda 25 years ago?
It's a very different kind of relationship. So the Taliban see ISIS-K as their primary rival. whereas the Taliban were hosting al-Qaeda. And the reason for this, I think there's a really significant difference between al-Qaeda and ISIS-K in the sense that al-Qaeda was always outsiders, right? So we remember the al-Qaeda, the way that al-Qaeda was started, that was during the anti-Soviet jihad, where a lot of these Arab fighters came to Pakistan and to Afghanistan. So they were always considered outsiders. They always had some kind of outside interest. What's different about ISIS-K is that these are people who are indigenous to the region, who are fighting. They're using an ideology that's similar in many ways, right? It's calling for this global caliphate. It's a globalized Islam. They see the Taliban as sort of backwards, a nationalist, really confused about like Pashtun cultural values and what is Islam. Right. So there's a tension there between ISIS and the Taliban. So, but when these but this global ideology that is really rooted in the region, which is very different from the kind of ideology that Al-Qaeda had. Al-Qaeda was never really able to anchor itself to the local population the way that ISIS, Khorasan has been able to do, which is really led by so many people from the region. The outreach in the local languages that they've really amped up in the past 3 or 4 years has been incredible presence on social media. And so they see themselves, the use of the term Khorasan is indigenous to the region. It's saying that Khorasan is this space that encompasses, we call Central Eurasia.
Right.
in many ways, even the National Resistance Front is, often uses this term Khorasan. It's something that's very evocative to the region that says we're a part of the world. We're not South Asia. We're this Persianate world, this area with these Persianate ties. And this is the kind of Islamic ideology that, suits our brand, but it's a global movement. So it gets, the Taliban then have promised the neighbors that we are a nationalist movement. We just want to take care of Afghanistan. We're not interested we don't have global aims and objectives. Now, that doesn't mean they don't support terrorism. So there's often this confusion between the Taliban's goals and their willingness to support terrorism, which they did in spades. And it's amazing now to watch the Taliban, cast aspersion on ISIS-K's willingness to use terrorism in Moscow. They condemned it. We condemn terrorism, they said, which was very sad and kind of amusing to see. So, but ISIS is the main rival. Because the Taliban have clamp down so much on any kind of opposition, whether it's women's groups, civil society, media, and so forth, ISIS-K becomes the only place. And there are these reports, early on that, former government officials or even national resistance forces were joining ISIS-K because it was the only venue that offered people a vehicle to challenge the Taliban, because we saw the rest of the domestic resistance in Afghanistan simply crumbled after 2021. The national security forces crumbled. And a lot of the leaders, the so-called warlords, they fled. They were the historic resistance, and they were completely demoralized after 2021. So the only people left standing were ISIS-K. And then they've been able to have, a presence in Afghanistan, but also be able to connect with neighboring countries. So not a good relationship, but also very different from the past.
Thanks. I think that's an excellent segue to my old friend and colleague Tom Sanderson, particularly looking into the aspect that supposedly for the perpetrators are Tajik citizens. Tom, let's turn the floor over to you. And let me just say, excuse me, that welcome to our audience. Jen is absolutely right. We have a really top rate group of experts in the audience. And please, if you have questions, if you could put them in the chat app on Zoom here, and we will come to them as best we can later in the discussion. Okay, Tom.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks for my co-panelists, the audience, and the Center for National Interest for this great opportunity. Very quickly, I want to reflect on a couple of points that you brought up with Jen. I wanted to note also on the Russia side that Putin, after the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7, made the implicit nod to their links with Hamas by saying that Muslims would not attack Russia. And so that's now not looking so good since the Crocus City attack. And then second, on the notion of the difference between the Taliban's relationship with ISIS-K and with Al-Qaeda. Jen did it beautifully. I would also note that when we look back over the last 30 plus years, you know, it was the Taliban that hosted and protected Al-Qaeda, but after 9/11, the roles switched to some degree where Al-Qaeda was helping to sustain the Taliban under 20 years of fighting led by the US. So that relationship is very tight. In a critical difference there with ISIS-K, but very importantly, as Jen mentioned, the difference between the Afghan Arabs that were so dominant in Al-Qaeda, and then the disaffected members of the Taliban and others inside Afghanistan who are much more hardline than even the Taliban are, and see them as insufficiently devout. So again, over to a few points here. You heard in the bio, I won't repeat it, but what I will note is that in the early 90s, I spent 4 years helping to develop the NGO sector in Central Asia. Right after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992, I started work on that, and it was my first exposure to the region. And then with you, Andy, and with Oya, and with my broader team at the Transnational Threats Project, we did a number of studies looking at Central Asian militants, violent extremists within Central Asia, within Afghanistan and Pakistan, but very importantly, inside Russia and in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And so I'd like the audience to just bear with me for the following detail that's directly germane to the discussion and to last week's attack in Moscow. Here we go. Okay, so from 20.
I'm sorry, there's been a request if you could turn up your microphone a little bit.
Yeah. From 2010 to 2017, we ran several projects looking at how Central Asians are recruited inside of Russia, how they're vectored to the battlefield in Syria and in Iraq, their activities within Central Asia. And that was also followed up with some visits in 2021 and 2022. And also a most recent visit to Afghanistan in 2019. So looking at how Tajiks and other Central Asians were radicalized and recruited outside of their home countries, we did interviews in Moscow, Yekaterinburg, Dushanbe, Fujian, Samarkand, and Tashkent. And what we found was that guest workers inside of Russia were obviously not under the same kind of repressive control that they were back home, and they were much more freely engaging with hardcore individuals. They were reached online. They were reached at informal mosques and formal mosques in Russia, and that we found that up to 2,500 of them were brought into Turkey largely, and then vectored against Syrian forces and against Kurdish forces and Iraqi forces in the 2014 to 2019 timeframe. The focus then was, you know, the movement. How were they getting from Central Asia? How were they being radicalized in Russia? Who was networking with them? Who managed them on the ground? But that was 2014 to 2016 when the flow was coming into Turkey and into Syria. And at the time, the numbers were 40,000 fighters from 130 countries. And again, we believe about 2,500 of those were Central Asians. By 2017, the flow started to reverse as gains by ISIS were dropping. And then the focus was the return of these battle-hardened, radicalized fighters going back into Central Asia, which is very much connected to what we're looking at today. And that is what's of great concern after the attacks in Moscow. That is a critically important context to any discussion we're having today about issues related to border security relationships between Central Asian states and Afghanistan. In just a few minutes on that before I finish, Central Asian states, as Jen has brought up, are rightly concerned to have the Taliban ruling Afghanistan. And to state the obvious, it was, again, the Taliban that hosted bin Laden and Al-Qaeda prior to the 9/11 attacks. And it was the Taliban over 2001 to 2021 timeframe that continued to enable and receive protection from Al-Qaeda. And today, the Taliban continues to provide safe harbor to Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan. Now, the question is, are those Al-Qaeda members a direct threat to Central Asia? Certainly far less so than ISIS-K And an argument could be made that no, they're not a threat because the Taliban has such a desire to normalize relations with their Central Asian neighbors, exerts enough influence over Al-Qaeda to prevent them from conducting any attacks. On top of that, there's a greater concern that Afghanistan is currently home to members of ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan Group, an affiliate of ISIS Central, which initially claimed the attack. ISIS-K then followed up with its own sort of messy claim to the Crocus city attack, but is much more opposed to Taliban rule and is certainly opposed to Central Asian regimes. Jen mentioned the attacks at Termez. We've had attacks inside Tajikistan. We had the 3 members killed in September from a different group, Jamaat Ansarullah. But it was last week's attack in Moscow that really brings home the reality that you have a cadre of Central Asian fighters, many of which were recruited and networked in Russia, many of which, 2,500 possibly, brought to the battlefields, radicalized there, networked with fighters from other parts of the world, including Pakistan, including Afghanistan, and in other parts of Central Asia, who now present a much greater threat as evidenced by this attack. That makes the reality of cooperation with Afghanistan ruled by the Taliban a necessity today, I think, in the minds of Central Asians, and the possibility that ISIS-K could undermine stability in Afghanistan even further makes that cooperation something that's a reality for us today.
Thanks, Tom. Let me just follow up on one point. The 4 badly beaten supposed alleged Tajik perpetrators of this. It looks from what I've seen that they were guest workers in Moscow, as there are so many from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and less so from Uzbekistan, probably, working in fairly menial jobs. Do you have a sense of where they were radicalized and where they were recruited? And if there was training that was required to conduct an act like this, where was that done? I've seen a report that one of them did leave Russia and then came back in through Istanbul. And I guess this also raises the question of actually how coordinated is ISIS Central and ISIS-K in this whole dynamic?
Yeah, well, let me take that last question first. The coordination is, of course, it's unknown to a great degree. These are covert organizations, but we do know that ISIS-K has a broad ability to act independently of ISIS Central, though they certainly benefit from the brand name. There is coordination, there are links. We know that from intelligence collection and intercepts of communications between them, and then evidence of travel between these regions and between areas that are found to have both ISIS-K and ISIS Central active. Do we know exactly where these guys were recruited? I haven't seen anything yet, but I would bet dollars to donuts that it was inside Russia. It's certainly possible they were recruited or radicalized elsewhere, but this is where you have millions of individuals who are susceptible to this kind of message. We know the historic and unfortunate links of the FSB with its green corridor of moving Dagestani and Chechens and others that they wanted out of the Caucasus into Turkey to engage in fighting inside of Syria. And then we know of the broader effort to allow fighters to come into Turkey in order to be used against Kurdish separatists and Kurdish fighters inside of Syria. So to me, it just obviously with incomplete information here and much more to come out, my guess is these fighters were radicalized, recruited, and trained inside of Russia. One or more may have, you pointed out more than one may have been in Turkey and may have conducted operations inside Syria. We know hundreds of them were there. I was there. We engaged in a number of these communities at mosques, at NGOs, in cafes. We learned that the Central Asians were used primarily for suicide attacks inside Syria and in Iraq. So to me, the most likely formulation here is that these were in Russia, these fighters were in Russia, they were radicalized there, recruited, and then vectored to different battlefields.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for a brief technical moment. Zakria, let's turn to you.
Hi, Andy, and many thanks for inviting me for this discussion. My discussion will be on another aspect, despite the fact that Moscow attacks is drawing a lot of attention around the world in the region. It's the construction of Qosh Tepa Canal, which diverts a significant portion of Amu Darya water into Afghanistan. So first, I would like to say that freshwater scarcity is a major issue as a result of climate change, and we see a cycle of drought and floods, and particularly in our dry region in Afghanistan and Central Asia. In Amu Darya, as I will call it, the Nile of Central Asia contributes vastly into freshwater resources in Central Asia and Afghanistan. Around 70 to 75 million cubic meters of fresh water is flowing through Amu Darya to Central Asia, and it's consisting the border between Afghanistan and Central Asian states. So first, we should consider the Soviet legacy of using Amu Darya waters, and as a result of wide in huge projects on Amu Darya waters, we have seen the catastrophic impact on water resources management in Central Asia, and as many have put it, like the Aral Sea catastrophe of 21st century is result of diversions and mismanagement of Central Asian fresh waters. So the background information is that while Amu Darya was the border, a big portion of border between Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. It was a border between Afghanistan and Soviet Union, and agreements of 1946 and 1958 actually was between Afghanistan and Soviet Union. Was talking about the border issues, not the water sharing agreements. And so far, Afghanistan and Central Asian states doesn't have abiding water sharing agreements on Amu Darya water resources. In 1992, the newly independent Central Asian states shared the Amu Darya River, which is a shared water between Afghanistan and Central Asia, and some excluding Afghanistan, and this wasn't given a share of Darya water flows. The Qosh Tepa Canal was initially the feasibility study was done in the 70s during President Dawood Khan time. And there is an interesting point which we have discussed about unwillingness of the Soviet leadership to actually Afghanistan be able to construct the Qosh Tepa canal, and as a result of that, there was a fierce discussion between President Dawood Khan and Brezhnev in 1977, and it's well documented. In 2018, USAID conducted a feasibility study and technical study of the Qosh Tepa canal, which is 287 kilometers long, and it will absorb a significant portion of Amu Darya River into Afghanistan. Lately, the Taliban government in 2022 started the construction of Qosh Tepa Canal by their own sources, to surprise too many. And the first stage of the construction has been completed, and now the work is going on the second portion. And the reaction from the Central Asian states was that we have a new user of Amu Darya water resources, and we should somehow deal with the situation. And the thing is that the whole volume of Amu Darya water flows was already distributed and shared between Central Asian states, and additional use of this water can create a lot of social and economic challenges to Central Asian republics. It's may result in social unrest in many parts of these countries. And interestingly, the Uzbek government was proactively engaging with the Taliban, and there were several high-level delegations of Uzbek government was traveling to Kabul, meeting with the Taliban leaders. Though Qosh Tepa Canal discussion was not surfacing officially, but it seems that under this discussion, besides all the security concerns that Central Asian republics states have in Afghanistan, the water issue added to these challenges. And the recent developments is that Turkmenistan has the de facto embassy of Taliban government in Ashgabat. After high-level delegations from Uzbekistan, the embassy of Afghanistan in Tashkent was handed over to the Taliban. And also one consulate in Karov of Tajikistan was handed over to the Taliban. So it means that there are some sort of engagement. And the other issue is that the recent development that will have impact on connectivity and relation between Central Asia and Afghanistan is that the World Bank released $300 million of funds for CASA 1000 electricity line from Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan to Afghanistan and Pakistan. So overall, the construction of Qosh Tepa, besides many questions about technical work, environmental safety, will have a huge impact on the relations between Afghanistan and Central Asia. And of course, it needs, as a point of view from engagement point of view, it's very important that in this already tense region, there is a lot of need for dialogue, and of course, technical capabilities in Afghanistan is not of existence, but still there is immediate need for engagement and sharing and coordination of fresh resources, which we need to major social and economic challenges to Central Asia and around the region. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think if we look probably the principal security challenges in the region, I think historically have been water and cross-border terrorist threats. Jennifer, I wanted to kind of follow up with you a little bit about your perspective on how the Central Asians diplomatically are engaging with with Afghanistan, and to what extent you are optimistic or pessimistic on the terrorism issue, cooperation, and also the water security issues that Zakria just raised with the building of the Qosh Tepa Canal. In a discussion we had a few weeks ago, Gavin Health pointed out how, I mean, one significant difference that we've seen diplomatically from Central Asian states is they are acting in a more cooperative way and engaging many other countries of the world. Do we see that, or do you expect to see that with Afghanistan?
Absolutely. I think the strategy of Central Asia towards Afghanistan has changed dramatically over the past 10 years. And, one of the reasons for that is the longer the United States was in Afghanistan, the more insecure it became, especially after 2014. And so this was a very pragmatic decision on the part of Central Asian states who are looking at the, post 2014, Afghanistan was not, regardless of how we feel about US withdrawal or not, the security, the country was increasingly unstable and insecure, and the US didn't seem to have an answer or a strategy to address it. So this left the Central Asian states, saying, well, the Taliban have promised this alternative. Of course, we don't believe them, but it seems like it's the only hope that we have. So there's not a lot of affinity towards the Taliban. I don't think they're huge fans of the Taliban, but remember, the Russian media, they need someone to Kadyrov the country. Look at how the Central Asian states have maintained their own, authoritarian systems. They're hopeful that they can maintain peace and stability using the same tools, and it's not anathema to them at all. Now, the issue of the Qosh Tepa Canal is very interesting because I think it really did catch the Uzbeks, for example, off guard. They had been really engaging with the Taliban and really hoping for very positive sum outcomes. Unfortunately, water is one of those things that's always zero sum, right? It's very hard to find a positive sum outcome with something like natural resources. And it's very interesting to see that Tashkent's reaction to Qosh Tepa was very similar to what we saw in Tashkent's reaction to the Rogun Dam in Tajikistan, right? So after Mirziyoyev came to power, this was this very huge hydroelectric dam, which was also going to take water, these scarce resources, from Uzbekistan. And President Karimov threatened war, right, with Rahman if Tajikistan went ahead and built this dam. When Mirziyoyev came to power, he completely reversed course and said, okay, fine, you do this Rogun thing. I think it's hard to say what, was sort of motivating this from Mirziyoyev's perspective, except the fact that he wanted to make peace with all of the neighbors, because as a double landlocked country, you need to have peace with your neighbors if you want to have trade. If you have growing populations, you need to have goods come in and out. And so that's why Afghanistan is so important for Uzbekistan in particular. And so when Uzbekistan's foreign policy changed in 2016, when Karimov passed away, it became more open and everything opened up in the region. That's just because of Uzbekistan's geographic proximity, touching on all 5 countries in the region. When Uzbekistan was closed, it was really hard to do these things. And so what Central Asia recognized after 2014 was that the Taliban are sort of their best bet. It looks like the US is betting on the Taliban as well. So Russia's betting on them, Iran's betting on them, China's betting on them, and how can they stand up to Taliban to do this? But these relationships aren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and they remain very mercurial, I think, still for the Central Asian states.
Zakria or Tom, do you want to make any comments to some of what's been discussed so far?
Well, Jen's final comments about, the US, Russia, and Central Asia looking to the Taliban, for engagement. I mean, there is no other option. And I'm not saying that we should recognize them, but the reality is they are the only governing power there. This attack in Moscow only heightens their role in impeding ISIS-K. And so that is only going to increase the notions that the Taliban has to be engaged in order to control and diminish a group like ISIS-K. So I expect that to happen, or discussions surrounding that to pick up speed.
Zakaria.
So for sure, the thing is that Central Asian states, as it was mentioned by Jen, that are more of a sort of pragmatic approach dealing with the situation in Afghanistan. And of course, when I've seen many articles when the Qosh Tepa Canal started in Afghanistan, many were predicting worst case scenarios, but it didn't happen because of the flexibility and pragmatism of the part of Central Asia, considering their security, their ties with Afghanistan, their future trade and connectivity issue, in particular when now the way is open for the electricity, the CASA 1000 project from the electricity line transmission from Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, via Afghanistan to Pakistan. So, of course, it means that Central Asian states are taking more pragmatic approach because they cannot be the luxury of relating what's happening in Afghanistan in reality, and they are closely monitoring the situation and taking action. And of course, as Tom was saying, that we will see more kind of engagement. Do we like it or don't like it? We can consider human rights records, rights of women and girls for education and work. But still, there is no other way rather than engage and particularly monitor the situation closely as the Central Asian states are doing.
Thanks. There were a couple of questions that were up. I see another one there now. Okay. One of them had to do with whether you think that there is a significant portion of disappointed Taliban members that have defected or left for ISIS-K, or other more radical Islamic groups in Afghanistan. And a second question was asking about the role of Pakistan, and to what extent is, well, I'm kind of interpreting this in my own way. Apologies to the original questioner, but to what extent is how engaged is Pakistan with ISIS-K and other radical groups within Afghanistan?
I gave quick answers to those, and let me just take them again, and then happy to hear others speak to them. My response to Alexei was, he said, could these disappointed Talibs join ISK? Well, they already have. That's the issue, is that is the base, or certainly constitutes a significant number of the ISIS-K membership are disaffected former members of the Taliban. And so we have that happening. And now you have this dramatic worldwide coverage of an attack in Moscow against the powerful Russians as another recruiting tool for these individuals who see ISIS-K as actually, they are at the tip of the spear. They're at the vanguard of the global jihadi movement with these attacks in Iran, in Russia, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Uzbekistan. So an attack like this only adds to that. And of course, Alexei's comment about the life not changing for the better. Yes, that is true for many Talibs, that they have not seen improvements in their lives. And in fact, there's a reduction of money and support in Afghanistan since the US withdrawal. So things are not good. And that does make a group that offers all these promises more appealing. But then the exclamation point is that attack in Crocus City. Moving to Richard's comment, Look, the ISI would consider any move to the benefit of the Pakistani state into the ISI itself. So nothing can be discounted in terms of what the intelligence services of Pakistan would do. This does sound a little bit fantastical, but again, just looking back at everything that has happened in the 80s, 90s, and through the 2000s, that ISI has done, you cannot rule anything out. Pakistan is deadly afraid of India more than anything else, and to have a rear area like Afghanistan under their control or influence is critical to their broader national security plan, and they will do whatever they have to do to make sure that that is stable or at least maneuverable.
Thanks, Tom. Jen, you want to weigh in on these questions?
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's really hard for us to know who's defecting where. I just don't think we have a lot of data on this. And a lot of people push back. There was all these reports in the beginning that, all the former fighters associated with the warlords, the former warlords that were part of the Republic, now we're all joining ISIS to fight the Taliban. And I think those claims were really exaggerated. The Taliban have been very brutal, absolutely brutal in their rule, and they have used social media so effectively to scare people away. And first for months and months, there were all these snuff videos that they were producing where they were coming after former Afghan national security forces in general, and they're still doing it on a regular basis. So of course, it's going to drive people into other organizations that may provide an alternative, but I'm not sure a lot of those people were really excited about the mission of ISIS. But I think we saw the same thing happen in Iraq. If we looked at where did ISIS start inside of Iraq, and a lot of them were those former security officers who were Baathists. Played a very prominent role in the start of ISIS. Now, with regard to Pakistan, it is, we should not be surprised to see all of these states change sides. I think the Taliban and the Central Asian states in particular have been quite surprised to see the degree to which the Taliban have tried to assert their independence from Pakistan. Because if you recall in the years before, the 5 years prior to the collapse of the Republic, the Uzbeks, for example, and the Tajiks, the Uzbeks in particular, had made an incredible outreach to Pakistan. If we compare it to the 1990s, to the 2000s, when Karimov said, Pakistan didn't exist as a country. He was so angry with them for housing militants and so forth. Even after 2001, he wouldn't engage with them at all. Mirziyoyev's strategy towards Pakistan has been completely different because he sees them as having the keys to transport. And a lot of the Central Asian interests are in transport, because when you're landlocked and you have growing populations, it's really expensive to feed your population and get things in and out, especially when you're under all of this pressure of climate change, droughts, all of the kinds of water pressure, right? We see what the Talibs are doing with Qosh Tepa. They're looking for solutions, and they're looking for innovative and high-tech solutions to actually address these problems. So Pakistan became really important to this conversation. But to see that the way that the Talibs have asserted their independence vis-a-vis Pakistan and their infighting, I think has been probably the biggest surprise if we look at what's happened over the past 3 years since the Taliban have taken over. Another thing is the Taliban have picked fights with every single neighbor, right? I mean, and this is another thing. You would think that the Taliban, who, these economic reports after the collapse of the Republic, were faced with a famine, we're faced with this, devastating economic situation, that they try to be nice to their neighbors and recognize that their neighbors actually helped, generate support even from the United States to keep them in power. To make the United States feel that it was okay to leave. Not that, it was a lot of the neighboring states who actually had these conversations with the US about they can deal with the Taliban. The Uzbeks were way out front on this. And, in the days after the collapse of the republic, it was the Uzbek foreign ministry officials who were putting these pictures on social media of of them in Afghanistan in the 1990s saying, hey, rest of the world, you're all scared of the Taliban. This is uncertain for you. We're fine. We got this. Look, we've known these people for decades. We're okay. They kept their embassies open when many European countries closed. So they wanted to show continuity. And the fact that the Pakistanis, they're going after the Pakistanis, it shows you how insecure the Taliban are as a ruling regime, is that they're doing this because of their own internal discord. So I think that's something to watch out for, and something that ISIS is going to be able to exploit. They're mobilizing, one of the things we haven't talked about are the foreign fighters, from Tajikistan, for example, that have set up camp for years now inside of Afghanistan. And the Uzbeks, right? I mean, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan has been on all sides of this. They've changed sides. The Pakistanis have changed sides. So this is a really hard area of the world to keep track of. It's very dynamic because there's so many countries and so many social movements and political movements and militant movements at play. But this opportunity for real cooperation that we saw after 2021. It seemed like the most cooperation we had seen in the region, ironically, happened after the U.S. withdrew. I mean, this is the great irony. We've never seen such great regional cooperation among the Central Asian states themselves and with Afghanistan and Pakistan, unprecedented. But ISIS-K, I think this attack and then the Taliban's foreign policy towards Pakistan really threatens to throw a real wrench into all of it.
Thanks. Yeah, Jennifer, you pointed to a very compelling question. That is actually the stability of the Taliban government itself, and to what extent its regional neighbors in Central Asia see the Taliban government as a partner that is a preferred partner, or is it they simply kind of taking a pragmatic approach for now that this is the partner that exists?
It's there. I mean, I think as Tom said very, very eloquently, there's no other choice, right? I mean, who else is there? The rest of the opposition fled. The former president fled. There's nothing else. And then the Taliban are not, willing to, have any kind of pluralism. You can see, the gender issues and the Central Asian states, they know this isn't good for Afghanistan. They know economically it's not good, socially it's not good. They know they know the history very well, that the longer these governments really, try to centralize authority and leave the voices of minorities out of the discussion, it's only going to blow up in their faces. We've seen this time and time again through the history of Afghanistan. So they want, and that's why you're seeing all of this pressure from Russia, even from China, on the Taliban for years since 2021 to be more inclusive. They've been pushing the Afghans on the gender issue, and they haven't been doing it as vocally, as the United States wagging its finger, but they understand that this is a real threat. This is a real threat to stability. So for them, these issues are very instrumental. They're not the outcome itself that matters. It's instrumental to producing the kind of long-term economic growth, stability, having Afghanistan integrated into the economic community. They want Afghanistan to be, peaceful and a normal country. It doesn't have to be democratic, but it just has to be, it could be just normal, but not a pariah state. And it's really behaving like a pariah.
Very interesting. Zakria, you want to add on your perspective of stability of the Taliban government, role of Pakistan? We do have one more question that's come in from Dana Maslimova. The question of what would we expect to see Russia use the CSTO more as a useful instrument for stability in Central Asia? We can turn to that after Zakria's comments.
So the thing is that during the Republic time in Afghanistan, all the time the talk was that Pakistan fully in control of Taliban. But what surprises everybody is that while Pakistan foreign policy is India-centric. Besides that, we've seen more security incidents between the Durand line. And at the same time, the Pakistani Taliban movement allegation between Pakistani government and the Taliban is continuing. The closure of border for trade between Afghanistan and Pakistan was a commonly disruptive issue for the time after the Taliban came to power. And forcibly, Pakistan forced millions of Afghan refugees out of Pakistan, which created a lot of social problems inside Afghanistan. So some mid-level Indian engagement with Taliban government from India is also there. But surprisingly, I may say that the relation between the Taliban and the Pakistan is not what we thought in the Republic time, that Pakistan is in full control of Taliban. Of course, when they were bombing them for many years, there is a certain number of personal connections. But overall, it seems that Taliban are trying to be more independent from Pakistani influence.
Very interesting. We have we're running out of time here. But Jennifer, Jen, you alluded to the criticality of transit corridors, including Afghanistan and Central Asia, Pakistan, India. This, of course, raises to mind the prospects for the long dreamed of TAPI pipeline. Has there been significant progress on the TAPI pipeline? And also, if somebody could address the question of expectations of Russia and the CSTO. I mean, I guess let me just preface this by one of the observations I did in organizing this was that with the withdrawal of U.S. military forces in 2021 and the likely significant diminution of Russian military forces and capabilities in Tajikistan and elsewhere in the region, with their intention being, with men and material being moved to Ukraine, how much is this security vacuum being felt significantly?
So it's really, I mean, it's a really good question. It's been hard to get really good information about the level and the presence. Maybe Tom has them or others have them, about the numbers of Russian security forces in Tajikistan. But I've always said CSTO, rest in peace. It's done.
Yeah.
The Moldovans are pulling out. Uzbekistan is not a member. Turkmenistan is not a member. Tajikistan is a member. But how many people are? And this is where we're seeing sort of forward movement by China in the security sphere in Central Asia. Right, the establishment of these military outposts inside of Tajikistan by China is because I think that they recognize that Russia's military capacity isn't what anybody had thought it was, and they're not reliable. So, there wasn't necessarily a security vacuum, an international security vacuum after the withdrawal of the United States. The Russians had 10,000 troops there guarding that frontier. But the other states are not members of it. And the Uzbeks have just increased their military spending by a very significant amount. It's got a lot of attention in the press there. So, recognizing that, trust but verify the Taliban, maybe that they hope that these investments in, the economic investments can generate stability. But I think there's little hope that they are who they say they can be. and that they've not been able to fulfill many of the reform promises that many of the it's ironic, right? The Central Asians pushing for political reform inside of Afghanistan. But I think this, CSTO's done. TAPI is, on again, off again. Apparently, according to the Taliban and the Turkmens, it's full on. Really hard to know. But I do think, once again, we should look at this irony here, is that the withdrawal of the United States made cooperation in the region much more possible and positive some than it had been at any time in recent history. So this is a really interesting outcome of the U.S. withdrawal from the region.
Thank you. Tom.
Great comments by Jen. And I did reply to Dana in the Q&A.
Thanks.
This is, of course, an opportunity for the Russians to make noise about playing a critical role in Central Asia's security and all along the border with Afghanistan. I do not know the numbers. The 201st Motorized Rifle Division has, fluctuated from 5 to 7 to 10K and then back down again. I can't imagine that some of those troops were not withdrawn to the battlefields of Ukraine that Russia invaded. So I don't obviously know those numbers, but this would be a good opportunity for them to make a statement about it, whether they have the capability to do anything. And as Jen points out, those outposts in Tajikistan are only going to grow. The Chinese have the money to do it, and they're not involved in a war with their neighbor.
On that tantalizing note, we'll need to conclude, as the witching hour is up. Let me thank Tom and Jen and Zakaria for really a fascinating discussion of a very complex set of relationships and a set of relationships that is very dynamic, very, very fluid. And I'll look forward to revisiting with you these issues in the not too distant future. Thanks to all for tuning in, and we will be in our next podcast in late April. We'll be looking at the relationship of the Gulf states with Central Asia. So on that note, let me thank everybody for tuning in, and thank you again for joining us, Jen, Tom, and Zakaria, and have a great afternoon, evening, and morning, wherever you may be.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for a great job.
Thanks.